Good afternoon, everyone. I really am very happy to speak with you about my book on Chinese undergraduate students. I wrote it and did research from 2012 and published it in the February 2020, so earlier this year. So let me share my screen with you at this moment. And so, as Margot just said, recently the Trump administration has made a series of policy changes that could have implications on Chinese students. And I just want to say that it is my research completed before that, but I will be more than happy to engage with questions about any of the recent policy changes. Let me try to share the screen at this point. Okay, so everybody can see it. Here's my book cover, and basically I just want to first give you some kinds of broad background or context for this book. And I'll give you a very, very brief presentation and try to leave the majority of the time for Q&A. So this is the enrollment statistic from 2005 to 2015. Where you can see that there is a huge increase of both undergraduate students population and graduate students from China. But the growth for undergraduate surpassed the growth of grad students. And the turning point is 2014. So ever since 2014, Chinese undergraduate population has become the majority of Chinese students population in the United States. And I also wrote some recent statistics because we all know that international student population declined overall, but Chinese student enrollment still increased, but the rate has slowed down quite a bit. So right now, I think the most recent statistics shows that undergraduate student population just exceed a little bit beyond 150,000, and that includes students with optional practical training. So OPT policy is very contested right now, and we can talk about it in Q&A. And talking about growth rates, so I was looking at what is the watershed moments of undergraduate Chinese students population in terms of the growth rates. And most people are attributing financial crisis as a major factor really bring about Chinese students because most of them are full-pay students. But this graph really shows that it really starts before financial crisis. It's during the year of 2006 and 2007, it's experienced the largest growth. And so that is really pointing at a few factors I wrote in the book that is oftentimes becoming under analyzed. One is the relaxing student visa policy really happening during George W. Bush administration when Condoleezza Rice was a Secretary of State. And that was in the aftermath of 9/11 when American higher education had experienced the round of declining enrollment, and they have exerted influences over the White House, and that has brought about the relaxing student visa or expedited process of visa process, and that directly contributed to undergraduate students who are fully funded, able to get the visa, okay? So before that, most of the students get the visa under the full funding from American higher education. So some students with even partial funding are subject to a higher rate of visa denials. So that is an important background. The other background is RMB appreciation. So you can see that RMB appreciated by 36% from 2005 to 2014, and that really enabled, with the rise of middle class in China, with their money worth more, they're able to afford this very expensive college education here. And so next is the 10 chapters in the book that I just want to give you a very brief introduction. It follows the structures of 3 stages: before they arrive in the United States. I was looking at how they're getting prepared, why they want to study abroad. I argue that there's a new education gospel in urban China. They view study abroad, including study in the United States, as a savior for them from this very competitive and cutthroat education environment in China. And then I was looking at the pathway they're coming here. And then after their arrival, I was looking at the academic and social experiences, their college and major choices. And then the third stage is looking ahead and what's their plan or intentions for their future. So the next is some media headlines surrounding this population. As you can see, some major news organizations oftentimes characterize Chinese students on their wealth. And most recently, the Trump administration really politicized this population, and they're oftentimes perceived as spies. So it's very important for me, part of my research motivation is trying to project their own voices and perspectives and trying to unravel more diverse experiences or compositions among this group. And here is so this is their mother's occupations and father's occupations as a sort of a snapshot to their actually pretty diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. It's not just, children of CEO, and especially I want to point out to you that as a college professor, I find it very interesting that college professors are among the top professions or occupations for both mothers and fathers to send their children to the United States. So in other words, Chinese higher education insiders are choosing American higher education for their own kids. And this is something quite revealing. And next, I want to walk you through the pathways I found. I identified 4 major pathways for Chinese undergraduate students to China to the States. And these 4 pathways are actually stratified by economic resources. What do I mean by that? So the first one is they're coming from regular Chinese public schools and then coming here to American higher education. The second is they're coming from Chinese public schools, quote unquote, but actually coming from international divisions, 国际部. For that, they often pay almost like private school tuition. It varies, but it's similar to almost like American private school tuition dollars. And then they're also coming from Chinese private schools to American colleges. The last one is for people who have studied American secondary schools, there is a humongous growth over the past decade in terms of their enrollment in private schools, especially private boarding schools. And the last pathway is actually the most expensive because they not only have to pay for tuition dollars, but also living expenses, like host families, oftentimes totaling like $1,000 a month. So actually the first pathway, if they go to Chinese public schools, which is not at all expensive, and then directly coming here is actually the least expensive way, okay? So from that, you can also see the diversity among this population. So in my research sample, close to 80% of the survey respondents traveled, well, the first and the second pathways to American colleges. So still, I finished my research in 2017, 2018, the end of 2017. So increasingly, as I'm starting my new project, new research, I increasingly found students are actually coming from the second pathway instead of just regular public schools. They're coming from 国际部. All right, so because of this socioeconomic diversity among this population, I found this very interesting social class and social reproduction as a sociologist. And I'm sorry, I have to really use that as and I identify this very sociological pattern. And especially what I term first generation college students from China. In other words, they're the first in their family to go to college. They are at the distinct disadvantage in several ways compared to their college educated peers. So their parents, either of their parents went to college already. Though the first generation college students are less likely to enroll in selective institutions, less likely to speak up in class, and less likely to have close American friends. So in terms of both academic and social integration, I would say they're at a distinct disadvantage. And I think that part is rarely recognized or acknowledged by American higher education in terms of their policy making. And next, I think this is a major part I really want to convey is what Americans get wrong about Chinese students. There are major 4 aspects. The first is Americans often believe that here Americans, I actually include a lot of my colleagues and American admissions officers as well. The holistic admission system in America has liberated Chinese students from the testing anxiety. And what I found is opposite to that because instead of Gaokao, there are new tests, TOEFL, SAT, and there are more tests because they can take those tests multiple times. Instead of Gaokao, they have to wait a year to retake it. For SAT and TOEFL, we know that they can take it multiple times a year. And for each time, they have to pay a lot of money for test prep and everything else. The secondly is, and then we can talk about why, why there's so much testing anxiety, largely because they don't really know much about holistic admission system. Americans may not really know much at all, and Chinese may, they're totally clueless about it because they're coming from the test exclusive admission system. So they're not really coming from the education system that prepare them for holistic admission system. What they can do is they know what they know best, which is to take tests. Okay, the second major misconception is they have little interest in making American friends. What I found is even though a lot of them don't really have American friends, they're very eager to make one. And it is largely the failure of the institutional efforts to reach out and establish what I would call structured platform to bridge the networks and help them achieve the social integration. The third one is the misconception is Chinese students do not speak up in the classroom due to language barriers, which is apparently true, but is far from sufficient explanation because when I survey the students, there is a way smaller number of students thinking that their English is bad or not good enough. And we know that Chinese students are very modest and they sometimes underestimate their language skills. But there are a lot more other factors. It's more of a structural and cultural barriers in terms of speaking up in classroom that I think American instructors need to know and provide better support. Last is Chinese students want to stay here in America for jobs or becoming immigrants. And so I do have some statistics here in my survey. Over 3/4, they do plan to continue their graduate school here. A large majority of them want to. But the intent to return after return to China is 61%. And it's very interesting that for people who have no plan to continue grad school, their intent to return rate is actually a little bit lower. So in other words, many people actually trying to go to graduate school in order to go to China because the graduate school can help boost their competitive advantages in Chinese job market. And oftentimes they go to better ranked graduate school than their undergraduate institutions. And this is compared to the doctoral graduate stay rate, oftentimes documented with national science data. National Science Foundation has a survey on doctoral recipients showing the rate is oftentimes as high as 85 to 95%. So undergraduate student population have a higher intention, at least, to return to China. And so what American higher education can improve, again, consistent with the 4 admissions, 4 misconceptions. Admissions officers, I argue that they need to do more direct recruiting in China instead of waiting in their offices and assuming that Chinese students have a full understanding about what holistic admissions entail. And there is a whole complexity of essays and personal statements and recommendation letters, and that Chinese students just don't really know how to do, and they don't really have people to turn to, for example, for recommendation letter. And this, you know, the admission professionals need to be aware and need to adjust their policy. A second is student affairs. This is really trying to help Chinese students with better social integration, because that's what they want, or at least a majority of them, they do want to better integrate it, and they need help, and they need help from the institutional level. Now largely they're left on their own. This sink or swim approach largely depends on their individual personality or initiatives, and that's something we can do better. A third is faculty instruction. That is in the context of speaking up barriers that I just talked about, that American faculty need to understand more what really stands in the way of Chinese students speaking up, and their teamwork, collaborations with American students, and trying to provide better support. For example, emphasizing that there is no right or wrong answer for your class discussion, and a smaller group is better than large groups. I can talk more in the Q&A. And career services as well, and considering that many Chinese students actually do want to return to China, and American career services need to provide that kind of additional support in terms of helping them to bridge with recruitment services in China or global China to help them find jobs there if that's what their career aspirations are. All right, so I'll just leave that, and I welcome your questions, and I'm pretty sure that there are many. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That gave us a great overview, not only of your findings, but of the situation of Chinese students at American institutions, at least before the last 6 months or so. I think things have changed considerably since education went remote. We have a very appropriate question related to your last comments from Ben Dees, who asks, what can American students do to be better allies to Chinese students who may be having difficulty finding a community on an American college campus? When I was a student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, I tried my best, but did not do enough. I would love to pass tips to my American friends who are still on campuses.
Thank you, Ben. This is a great question, and I want to personally, you know, showing my appreciation towards your effort. And I think anything is very helpful. From my interviews with Chinese students, and they're talking about their American friends, taking them to football games, to stand-up comedy shows, those kinds of American culture that they're actually very eager to get some immersion, but do not really have the opportunity. And one thing that I think Chinese students don't really appreciate from their American friends is without really knowing them enough, and you know, right off the bat, engaging them into some kinds of politically sensitive or they would say offensive questions like Tibet or human rights issues. And not that they don't really want to engage in those kinds of conversations. They feel like sometimes, you know, Americans are having certain kinds of predetermined ideas, and they want you to have some network first, some kinds of mutual trust, some relationship built, and then engage in those kinds of conversations would be better. And lastly, actually in my book, I really lays the responsibility on American institutions. I think there are a lot of resources, a lot of American students like B who wants to help and who wants to learn from Chinese students. And ultimately, international education is about learning about and learning from each other. And sometimes for international students, this is oftentimes becoming the one-way street of learning and expectation for international students to adjust, adapt to their host society. And so I think American institutions really need to take a more proactive approach to connect people like B, what's her name? People like Ben, sorry, and Chinese students who are also eager to make American friends. There are definitely some Chinese students who are not eager. That's a fact. But what I'm saying is there are a lot more Chinese students who want to but who are not able to. So that's something that's a pocket of population that I think American institutions need to do more work.
Thank you. We have a question from Lei Guang of the University of California at San Diego. He asks, have you found any research on how studying in US colleges has or has not changed the political values or views of Chinese students?
It's a great question. I did address that in part in one of the chapters when I was asking them how they reflect their changes. Okay, so this is a part of their own self-reflection about the kinds of personal changes they have been through since studying here. So I'm not a political scientist, so political attitude change is not the major focus of my book at all. But the data does show that some of the Chinese students have undergone some kinds of changes with respect to political attitudes, in a sense that they have some kinds of a more realistic and critical picture of American political system, such as, for example, the election of Donald Trump. I remember some students specifically talking about how democracy works sometimes not very well in terms of electing somebody that people are complaining so much about. Remember the context that Chinese students are surrounding themselves, and that's American higher education. And that's a pocket where they oftentimes hearing about, people are are critical about Trump policies. So there's this kind of, I think the disconnect between what Chinese students experience in America, the community they're in, oftentimes American higher education. They're not the bastions of Trump supporters. And so they're very confused and sometimes disillusioned about democracy and electoral system. So that's something that I find in my research about, yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, Dulal Chanda of Berkeley College. Can you please elaborate on reasons behind the speaking up in class problem other than their limited English language ability? So why is it that Chinese students don't speak up in class?
Very good question. Thank you very much for raising this. And language certainly figures a very important role, but I can tell you that only 35% of Chinese students think their English are not good or excellent, but close to 60%, almost twice as much students don't speak up often in class. So that really means there's something else going on. So one of the major factors is what I would say the test-oriented education system they're coming from do not really prepare them to engage in oftentimes open-ended classroom discussion. So that is really the gap between Chinese education system and American education system. Just give you one example that in a lot of courses, when a professor asks a question, I've been teaching at SU for the past 14 years, and I experienced that for the first hand. When I was teaching my sociology class, almost every question I ask does not really have a yes or no answer. or does not even have the right answer. It's open-ended. It's trying to stimulate thinking. It's trying to jumpstart some kinds of discussion. But many Chinese students are oriented in their prior schooling that when they raise their hands and answer the question, they're judged whether it's a right or wrong question or a wrong answer or whether it's a good enough. They're feeling that they're evaluated. So I think that's a major difference. You would say that's a structural difference in terms of the system, education system differences. I think Americans, professors need to know, and they need to offer more reassurances to students. Like I tell my own colleagues, basically saying that you just need to say simple things like, there's no right or wrong answer. There's no stupid questions, things like that to reinforce so that students at least feel a little bit reassured that if they want to say something, they're not really evaluated. So that's number one. Number two is the cultural. It's really the cultural barriers that I really talk about a huge difference. I think education system is an integral part of the culture, actually. And in a broader culture, there is this very different approach to speaking. In China and East Asia, actually more broadly, I said this, runs the risk of gross sort of or overgeneralization, but there is some pretty robust literature in education, in national education research showing that in East Asian culture, more broadly, oftentimes explained by Confucianism, that speaking is discouraged or not as encouraged as in the West. And there is a much longer tradition of oratorial training and excellence in America. Just look at Western political leaders, from Barack Obama to any Western, the UK Prime Minister. And making speech is a necessary part of getting elected. But if you're looking at Chinese presidents, if you're looking at South Korean presidents, and people are having a very serious face, and they're not really evaluated based on how eloquent they are in terms of their political accomplishment or this personal character. So there is that, and not to speak, Confucianism really discouraged, students or learners to speak very appropriately. So people are having this kind of evaluation or I don't want to say self-censoring. There's definitely something going on, but that's, I think, with particular reference to certain topics. But with the general discussion, I think there is a self-critic in their mind, not just in terms of the language. There's self-critic about whether I'm speaking English good enough. I am whether I'm making grammatical mistakes, as well as the content, whether the questions I raise is a stupid one, or whether the discussion I just participated is appropriate. That kinds of self-critical voices going on, and that's very much related to the culture. And I think American university and their professors need to be informed. If in a lot of campuses, 10% of this population are Chinese, if not more.
We have a question from Tom Gold, University of California, Berkeley. Can you say something about the role of companies in China that prepare Chinese students to apply to American colleges and succeed there? E.g., some of these companies allegedly do all the applications for the students on letters of recommendation, teaching them not to write the letter themselves and get a teacher to sign it. Other services lets Chinese students understand the diversity of higher education institutions in the US, especially four-year colleges and universities. Especially now that many of them are in financial trouble, they welcome full fare paying Chinese students and also do cultural prep. how to succeed in American college and adapt to life in the US overall. I think there are about 15 questions in there, so take as many as you wish.
All right, thank you, Tom. I'll try to take it one by one and let me know whether I left out any questions, okay? All right, so first of all, this is a great question and a very significant one. I think talking about American media coverage, and I think they have covered quite a bit of this, and that has definitely cast some shadow on this population as well. And I did ask students about it, and in my I didn't really say I carried out a mixed method study. I did have surveys and in-depth interviews, and I don't really have survey data on that because it's just hard to collect quantitative information on that. So I raised questions during the in-depth interviews. What I found is a huge range of very diverse picture here. So in other words, some students have not really used at all about those companies. They're doing the DIY, do-it-yourself approach, even though that's a minority of students. And for those students who are doing DIY, they oftentimes have family members or close relatives or good friends who are helping them. So in other words, anybody need help. Probably American students also need help in this navigating this very much complicated and holistic admissions process. For the companies, first of all, they're largely unregulated. So in other words, Chinese government has not even intended to regulate them. It's very much subject to this new liberal market mechanism. So they're usually privately run, and they're oftentimes varies in terms of size and scale. Largest companies like Xingdongfang, New Oriental Company, has huge operation in different cities. And I know that in major cities, their operation size is like billions of dollars a year. But other agents, other companies are one person shop. So because of this lack of regulation, the quality control is problematic, to say the least. That is why, Tom, you have mentioned the problematic cases. But what I want to say is, because of the quality is very, very much diverse and varying quite a bit, there are some agents and some students are very satisfied with their agent support, and they're doing a decent job in terms of trying to support without compromising the independent voices of those students. So in other words, the students write their own essays, they gave to the company for editing, or the company had or the agents help sit down with the students, very much similar to what here the private consulting firms are doing, helping with American students, their college application process, what the counselors are doing. And the other big piece of it is what I said, what I described, the international division, 国际部. The international division has oftentimes counseling division. So they're doing a very professional job as well. They oftentimes hire counselors from the West, people who have experiences, who are former educators, or who are former counselors in the US and UK, or other English-speaking countries. So, so they're usually doing a very professional job, really depending on where you are and what kind of services students are turning to. So the kinds of services they provide vary quite a bit in terms of the quality. And that's to a great extent because the market is unregulated. And I have to say that Chinese students are they're subject to exploitation. They are in the dark oftentimes. So if they're having the good service, they find it very lucky. If they're not, and some of the students feeling they're cheated by themselves, by their agent, for example. Some of the students complaining that the agent does not even show the admission letters to them, just saying that you got the admissions from this school and that school, and then this is the offer letter that they finally go. So it's just showing one offer letter to them and the student finally go. So that's a pretty extreme case as well. What I'm trying to say is Chinese students oftentimes are the victims in the process. They pay tremendous amount of money, and American admissions officers and American higher education oftentimes turn a blind eye to it because that's the easy thing to do. So that's why I think, that's why I propose that the American higher education should intervene by not really subjecting Chinese students in that way, by directly recruiting in China, setting up partnership with their local quality high schools. Every city has key school, so they can directly have recommendations from their teachers who know the students better, so that the students don't really have to pay so much outside for the external services and then subject themselves to rounds and rounds of tests to boost their admissions prospects. Tom, does that address your questions?
It addresses a lot of his questions. We have a question from Louisa Ferreira, who wonders whether the experiences of Chinese students studying in other parts of the world are similar to what they experience in the United States.
This is a good question, but sorry, I cannot really answer it because my research is limited to the United States. But my reading, and I have friends and colleagues in the United Kingdom, for example, finding out very similar pattern. For example, the lack of social integration, and they also have to take a lot of tests. And oftentimes, Chinese students and their families take tests multiple times. And there is a huge test machinery in China, profit-driven industries that also tend to exploit. So those kinds of mechanisms are similar. But probably the holistic admission system in America is kind of unique. And that really make Chinese students very confused and in the dark in terms of, how to really craft the personal statements, how to really write those interesting and meaningful experiences that are inspiring, and for some of them they don't really have. They're in the test-oriented education system, and they don't really have a lot of internship or civic engagement opportunities, and a lot of those high school. By the way, a most important thing that I did not even mention is the education infrastructure is different. They don't really have counselors for the most public schools because they don't need counselors for college applications. They're just taking the tests, and then their test scores decide where they can enroll. So the recommendation letter thing is a big mess that they have to turn to their English teachers sometimes, because a lot of them don't even know how to write in English.
We have a question from one of your fellow public intellectuals program colleagues, Minye from BU. How are Chinese students adapting to the new Cold War and decoupling between the United States and China?
Well, thank you, Ming. This is a very important question. When I was doing the research, Trump was already elected, was at the end of my research. So I did have a few opportunities to raise this question and assess the impact. And then I can also share with you my own thoughts about the current climate. No doubt, they're very worried and they're very anxious. My book is entitled Ambitious and Anxious. I think the Cold War definitely exacerbates the anxiety because the perception is America is not friendly to China. The bilateral relations is going downward, and they're having a difficult time. So with that said, to what extent does that influence Chinese students' education decisions in terms of whether they decide to keep continuing? And I think the answer is yes, because Chinese students, they're very concerned with their degrees. So in other words, regardless of the Cold War or pandemic, the top priority for them is to graduate. And so this is something that Americans are sometimes not so clear because, for example, the dropout rate in the United States among Americans are usually very high. I mean, depending on the institutions. At Syracuse, where the R1 institution, our retention is only 70%. Probably being BU has a little bit higher retention, and lower tiered universities has even lower. I think overall, Americans have probably attrition rate is 50%. So, but in China, there is a very little, the concept of dropping out from college is culturally unacceptable. So it's a extremely high rate of graduation among college students in China. Well, you can have different perspectives to interpret that. My colleagues, I have some friends in China who are interpreting this as Chinese higher education has low quality, they don't really have quality control, so they let so many students graduate. But on the other hand, regardless of the reason, I think it breeds a culture of persistence, of completing the education they started. So, so I think my personal view is unless we have the policy from the administration, either government, that make their continuation of study in the United States impossible, either visa issues or travel bans, they're going to continue and complete their studies. But for future students who have not really started their education but thinking about it, I think definitely the perception is going to discourage them from studying in the United States. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions that were written before that one, but can be considered follow-up questions. One is from Bill Armbruster, a retired journalist, and the other is from someone who chose to remain anonymous. Bill's question is, do you have any estimate about the percentage of Chinese undergraduates who will not be returning to their American universities this fall because of COVID-19? And the related question is from the anonymous person, what's your view of the Huawei situation and the Chinese students studying STEM majors?
All right. Okay. So I will address the first question first, which is about my estimate about the percentage of Chinese students not being able to return to the United States. I think I haven't really conducted research at this point for this particular question, but on my home campus, we're getting ready for them not to return. So I think that's what many universities are doing. They're trying to find some partner institutions in China so that they can have some kind of residential programming. At the same time, they're enrolling in the online education. So we are told to prepare, even if we're preparing for the residential programs in the fall, we're told to prepare hybrid version to a great extent for the international students who are not able to return to campus.
And the Huawei angle?
All right. The second question is my view on Huawei and the international Chinese students studying STEM. I think Chinese students in STEM are particularly subject to those kinds of anxiety because they're targeted, right? But it's very important actually to recognize that the administration's policy is very much it's not just having a negative impact on Chinese students. It's actually very much having a negative impact on American technology. So for Chinese students in STEM areas, my research at least show that their stay rate or their intention to stay is higher than Chinese students in non-STEM areas. So in other words, for people in my field, for example, their return rate to China is actually pretty high. But for Chinese students in STEM areas in the United States, they can find many opportunities. That's why their intention to stay is stronger than in non-STEM areas. So I think the current situation definitely posed bigger challenges for them than in other areas. And for American technology, it's not the good news. And I think most recent, I just read a working paper from Georgetown really showing that in artificial intelligence alone, 1/3 of the top papers were written by Chinese authors. So it's there a lot of international students turned immigrants. They're actually the backbone of Silicon Valley and high tech. So and what this policy and future policies of continuing to limit Chinese students in STEM areas to work in the United States are going to really exacerbate the technology issues, the talent shortage in the United States.
We have a question from Helena Kalinda of the Henry Luce Foundation. Did your research look at demographics in terms of how many students come from urban areas and from rural areas?
Yes, great question. This is a very urban phenomenon, and that's why when I was arguing that their socioeconomic conditions are very diverse, but the overall picture is they're the privileged population. 95% of my sample are coming from urban residents. So studying abroad is distinctly urban phenomenon in China. And what I just want to emphasize is among this privileged population, there is a lot more socioeconomic diversity among them. Some of them, a huge number of them are middle-class professionals, and some of them are working-class families. And I wrote a couple stories in the book really showing that some working-class, especially from major cities like Beijing or Shanghai, their parents' salaries are just unimaginably low to be able to afford their American higher education here. The tuition dollars at University of California or Boston University or Syracuse, and they're coming here because their parents are selling their downtown apartments, which is small already because they appreciate it so much, and then relocating to a distant outskirts of the urban areas to realize the profits so that their children can go to college here. Yeah.
And there's a wonderful, the way you describe it in the book, corollary to that the Chinese students come from the glittering new modern Chinese cities and end up in parts of the United States that are not what they imagined. And you quote from an urban Chinese student who wound up at Beloit, from Beijing to Beloit. And she wrote, "Before I came, I thought the US was," I'm sorry, it's a little dark here, "was all like the glittering high-rises and rich city. I could never have imagined American society so rural and boring, or imagine this rural place, but I never imagined it would be so in the middle of nowhere. It's even hard to find a taxi here."
Yeah, I remember that interview. That students are saying that they found one taxi and they hold on to that taxi driver's number because that's the only one she can find. So yes, there is quite a bit of disillusionment as well, and some students think that New York City represents America, and turns out it's not. Yeah, this is a very largely urban population, for sure.
We have a question from another faculty member at BU, Eugenio Menegon. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I find that university offices of admission are black boxes, especially for us faculty. We are sometimes frustrated at the way Chinese students are admitted without sufficient vetting or preparation, but feel powerless as faculty as we are at the receiving end. You mentioned solutions like recruiting tours in China. Could you give us examples of what admission operations of US institutions might have done well in recent years, and how faculty can be involved in helping with good admission practices?
Yes, actually, I have done some field work in China, and this is something what I found in a private school in China. That private school is not at all competitive or prestigious. It's set up by one former educator who is fed up with the mainstream education institutions. So basically, what he got is a lot of students who could not really survive in the competitive mainstream public schools. So they sent their kids to his school. Okay, so this now he's becoming the principal of the school, and this principal was formally educated in the West. I think he got his master's degree in higher education administration. So he has some kinds of networks here in the United States. What he did is, in his high school, there is no testing, and he discouraged his students to go out to any kind of external agencies for counseling help or test prep. And he said he wrote the recommendation letter for every student. And what he did is he visited many lower tier, second tier liberal arts colleges, very small in America, and established some kind of a partnership between those liberal arts colleges and his tiny little school, because he thinks that his school is small and the students in his small school are going to be very suitable for the small liberal arts colleges in the West. So I did the research. I visited his school a couple of times. The most recent time is 2017, and he showed to me that he has set up partnership with 19 liberal arts colleges in the US. And under the partnership, there's no requirement for SAT. There is only requirement for TOEFL, I believe. And the score is way much lower than the major universities or other liberal arts colleges. I think a couple of students scored 80 and they got in. And in addition to that, those liberal arts colleges offer the students a scholarship up to $10,000, $20,000. So it's really a win-win situation. These liberal arts colleges, they get good students recommended by this principal, because the principal knows the student intimately. So there is a good vetting process. At the same time, the students, they're oftentimes sort of not enjoy their time in regular Chinese schools, did not have to go through this rat race of testing, and having this way much straightforward supported mechanism of admissions process to the college. Yeah, so I actually interviewed a couple of students. One of them enrolled in St. Paul at Minnesota, and he had a very, very productive time there. And what he decided to do is after completing his education at St. Paul, he's gonna work as a teacher back in China from his original school. This is a sort of independent school in China. So it's actually very interesting. Chinese education system in recent years, because of the problem in the mainstream, has actually booming with all those kinds of small independent schools. There actually has a very good market there. Yeah.
We have another anonymous question. What is your advice about the impact of teaching via Zoom on academic freedom issues? There is concern about putting students in China in an awkward or problematic position given the PRC government sensitivity.
That's a great question. I'm actually thinking about it. So again, a disclaimer that a disclaimer that I have not really done any research with regards to that question. But given that I will be teaching this fall myself, I'm actually thinking that this question probably needs to be treated by subjects to some extent. Certain subjects like STEM, like math, could be having different nature of issues with academic freedom than political science, for example. And I think as the university, we probably need to provide alternatives to faculty for the sake of either backup or, different faculty have different preferences as well in terms of, so I think Zoom as the only option is problematic, and we need to have alternatives provided to faculty. And I do believe that academic freedom run into different issues or having different differential extent of problems in different domains and subjects. And certain areas of studies, these issues are more acute than other areas, are more prominent. Yeah.
We have a question from Mary Sito. Which countries will benefit if fewer Chinese students come to the U.S.?
Canada? I think many countries will benefit, but now the problem is there is this, the geopolitical tensions are not just between the United States and China. There are a couple Western countries with Chinese government, the relations go downwards. So international education experts have predicted more of a intra-Asia student mobility. So in other words, students could think about going to Japan, going to Singapore, and other places, and even Hong Kong. And this is this is counterintuitive. It's opposite to our expectation. But if you're talking to college professors in Hong Kong, their applications, even with this, not most recently, but with all the protests starting from last June, but their applications from mainland China is not really going down. So yeah, so which countries are going to benefit most? Probably countries closer to China.
I think we have time for one more question. This comes from Anna Kendrick, and I apologize to all those whose questions I have not gotten to. Does your research give you a sense of why some students go abroad to the US or UK, Canada, etc., versus those who opt for internationally accredited joint venture universities in China? What financial versus political versus personal choices come into play, and how might students' backgrounds, trajectories, or opportunities differ? Or rather, what differences might Chinese students and parents perceive?
Thank you so much. This is a great question, a very important one, especially given the current, the pandemic and beyond. I think the joint venture, the internationalization at home model probably will be increasingly popular. That's my sense. But by the way, for all the other questions, and I have not really got time to engage, you're welcome to email me and reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to address them. So for this question, I have not really conducted the comparative analysis of students' different choices or how they really calibrate their choices compared to, compare students studying in the United States and UK and on the mobility model with students studying at NYU Shanghai or Kunshan Duke with the internationalization at home model. And you reminded me that this is actually a great project to look into. And so again, my sense is because internationalization at home is actually less expensive for sure, and less expensive financially, less costly personally and politically. They're not at all subject to travel ban, for example. And they're going to be increasingly popular. And from the education equity perspective, as a sociologist of education, I actually very much advocate internationalization at home model, because I think that's going to provide a more accessible model of international education to more students. Just like Zoom, to some extent, that we expand our access to audience rather than, I would very much be interested to speak in person at the national committee, and that's actually our original plan. But I think the audience we draw probably physically is fewer than now on Zoom. I think likewise, internationalization at home will provide a expanded access to for international education for Chinese students, rather than they have to travel thousands of miles away and subject themselves to all kinds of additional financial, personal, and political costs.
And the anxiety, to get back to the title of the book, of applying for visas.
Exactly. I didn't mention that.
Even without the restrictions that President Trump has recently imposed, the consulates and embassies around the world are not processing anything except emergency visas right now.
Right.
And when they reopen, there's going to be an enormous backlog.
Right.
So even students who are ready to get on an airplane and come to the US or go anywhere else are going to have a hard time getting visas that will allow them to do so.
That is why my answer to, I think someone raised this in the questions, is that in the fall, we're getting ready for Chinese students not returning. And this is regardless of their personal intention. It is because of the visa barrier.
We could go on with lots and lots more questions and discussions. I hope that people will read Ma Yingyi's book. We've put a link to it in the chat function so that you can order a copy. I would encourage everybody to read it. She got to some of the topics that she covered in the book today, but there's a great deal more. It's a really rich analysis of what motivates Chinese students and their parents, why they come here, what they encounter when they get here. It's very, very much worth reading. Thank you very much for giving us the time today, and thank you to everybody from around the country and beyond who joined us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Margot, for your wonderful big moderator role. And I appreciate all these questions. And if any other additional questions we have no time to attend to, please email me. And I look forward to addressing and engaging with them. Thank you. Thank you all.